fan of the Lead with Courage podcast? Then we'd love you to join us for our first ever live podcast recording happening on the 8th of May in Brisbane. We'll be joined by special guests Matt Craddock and Kirsty Rourke, both inspirational leaders and ambassadors for the Vinnie's CEO Sleep Out. For more information and to book your ticket, go to luminateleadership.com.au/Lead with Courage podcast. All funds raised will go directly to the CEO Sleep Out. We can't wait to see you there.
Hi, I'm Chloe Canning. Welcome back for Season 2 on Lead with Courage. Luminate Leadership acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land, which we would call this podcast the Yagara and Turrbal people. We pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging.
Welcome to Lead with Courage, the podcast that celebrates the bold and inspiring stories of leaders making a difference. We're your hosts, Andy and Cherie Canning, and together we'll dive into the minds of the trailblazers, the risk takers, and those who embrace life with a growth mindset.
Now, I know that we come on here and say we're inspired by all the guests that we have on Lead with Courage, and that is true. But I honestly don't know that I walked out of any other conversation and started crying. And that's exactly what I did with this guest. Now, I was crying for all the right reasons. I was truly inspired by the conversation that Andy and I had with Joshua Creamer. For those of you who are familiar with Josh and his work, my response would not come as a surprise. For those of you who aren't familiar with Josh yet, he is one of the very few Indigenous barristers here in Australia and is responsible for working on the most complex and large human rights cases such as the Palm Island Inquiry and the stolen wages. This conversation for me was more than just that. It was an education, one that really opened up my eyes and left me feeling a sense of pride and a sense of urgency and necessity for us to act and be part of the change. Josh's calm demeanour and his optimism was truly why he is a great leader of our time, and we were so honoured to have him on the podcast. We hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as we did.
Josh Creamer, welcome to the Lead with Courage podcast.
Glad I'm finally here. I think I'm probably episode 3000, but I made it on. You had my wife on very early.
Yes, we did.
And we've ran into each other in the street and talked about it, but I'm finally here with both of you. I'm looking forward to it.
It's fantastic to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Don't know about episode 3000. I think if we're still here on episode 3000, we'll hopefully make a couple of dollars for the podcast and change some lives along the way. But yeah, really, really grateful to have you here. And as you said, we've had Cara on, and she was an incredible guest. And I've recently listened to your podcast that you recorded on ABC Conversations as well, which was incredible, really, really moving. And I'm excited to hopefully touch on a couple of those points today, as well as some others, I'm sure.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you. People may or may not know you, Josh, as one of the handful of Indigenous barristers here in Australia. And also something I want to talk to you about today is your second Everest Base Camp trip, which is coming up at the time of this recording. It's next week. But before we jump into that and go through those stories, we'd love to ask you the question we start with every time, which is, what does Lead with Courage mean to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I've been a leader since the age I was 12. My mother and stepfather separated when I was young. I was the oldest of 4 siblings. I played a role of the father in the house at that young age. I went to high school. I was one of 13 Indigenous kids in the school, grade 12, out of school of 650 boys. And so people always looked on me as a leader, whether it's in family, whether it's in life. And now, as you say, I'm the second, law's about hierarchy, and I'm the second most senior Indigenous barrister in the country, but there's only a handful of us, about 10 or 12. And for me, it's always been about personal sacrifice, whether it's in the home or whether it's out there through my work, making those sacrifices, things that actually hurt you, are tough to do, but you know they're going to have an impact on the community.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, when you say that about hurt you and the impact, I actually rewatched yesterday for the second time the Incarceration Nation special that you featured in. I say I watched it for the second time, and I really wanted to turn it off because I was in tears. It was just so uncomfortable and hard to watch. And I didn't, because exactly what you've just said, you can't just turn away. And for those who may or may not know what you've been involved in, 2 landmark class actions as a barrister, the Palm Island case, the death in custody, and the stolen wages, Queensland, which I believe is Australia's largest human rights case, and they're cases that you've led. We mentioned your phenomenal wife, and she tells me that what she said to me, which I thought was fascinating for what Cara does, what I see Cara does in the world. She says, I look at what my husband does and think I need to do more in the world because of the impact that you're having and what you're doing, which I just think is phenomenal, and the impact you have in the community. So could you tell us, actually we are going to get into what you're doing now, the conversations with the elders, but I would like to know a little bit about your early life. You just mentioned about growing up in North Queensland. I would say potentially, as you said, being a father figure to your younger siblings, potentially life wasn't going to be predicted to be in this position. Could you tell us a little bit about your younger years, Josh?
Probably no truer statement was ever said than what you just said about, and life was never going to be this way. Mount Isa is a tough town. I was there this week actually seeing family. I brought my granddad's place a few years ago, and all my family live there now. It's funny because I wanted to keep that going on. But it was a challenging life. In our household there was a lot of domestic violence with my mother and my stepfather, and so I grew up in that, and it has an impact. That legacy of trauma has a real impact on you. A lot of kids I know are tough kids. Primary school, they were pretty well raising themselves. Their parents were working out on cattle stations, or their parents were up at Aboriginal communities like Mornington Island. And at 10, 12, 13, we were just kicking around like we were in charge of our own lives in a lot of ways. My mother was there, but you just grow up with your own sense of responsibility, and you do whatever you want. And so I can see how young kids in those communities get in a lot of trouble because they're out there and they hang around with older kids and things go bad. But, I grew up in that environment. I thought, and my mother, fortunately, I think she left my stepfather, and I say fortunate because, there was probably 2 outcomes for that. Someone would have died or someone would have been in jail, and so it took a lot for her to move away from her family. She's the youngest of 12. So I grew up with this massive Aboriginal family. I feel like I'm related to everybody in Mount Isa, and my grandfather was there. He was a real stalwart of the community. And she had to leave all that. I remember on my wedding day, I was about 30 years old, and I said at this age my mother was leaving Mount Isa with 3 kids in tow and probably $50 in the bank. Wow. And so I grew up in that environment, and probably when I started high school, it was funny. I remember starting high school, and we were all, we probably all had PTSD, to tell you the truth, in my household. And we were just shadows. We sort of lingered, and we didn't really exist as a family. And things turned a corner for me, actually, when I started grade 10. I just started working in this butcher shop after school, 6 days a week, a bit of extra money for at home, made a real difference, my own independence. Also gave me an opportunity to have my own identity. And that was a real, as I say, a turning point for me. And I finished school. I did an apprenticeship as a butcher. I'd made that commitment. But I was always keen to go on and do other things in the world. And one of the things my mother was really good at was just instilling in us an importance of having our own ideas and a good sense of what was right and wrong, a good sense of social justice issues, Indigenous issues. And I remember being 10, 12 years old, and she'd ask me about these things in my opinion. And it's actually a similar conversation I have to my 9-year-old daughter now. And that developed into an interest in politics and law and social justice and all those issues. And I thought I'd work in the mines. Actually, when I finished my apprenticeship, that was something I wanted to do because all my family worked in the mines, all the men. But I found my way to law school, and 20 years later, I'm, like I say, one of the few Indigenous lawyers in the country.
That's incredible. Really incredible. Talk about rags to riches, or it's a terrible expression, really, but kind of coming from the back to the front.
I say the bush to the beach because I lived in Yeppoon in central Queensland, and then to Brisbane. So there's the 3 limbs of my life.
Yeah, bush, beach, Brisbane, the 3 Bs. Yeah, amazing. And I guess if we can just touch on some of the work that you're doing at the moment. When I was looking at the stolen wages, I think that a lot of people are familiar with the stolen generation, but then can you tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing, the travelling, the conversations?
Yeah, I've always travelled as a big part of my work, and most of that time I've spent in Aboriginal communities or travelling around the country talking to Aboriginal people about their lives. You touched on a little bit the Palm Island case with the death of Murungi Doomadgee, but that was 2015-16, and then after that I moved into these historical class actions. So class actions were primarily suing the government on behalf of Aboriginal people for wrongs that have been committed usually from about 1930 to 1976, but it actually starts a little bit before that period. And so Queensland, we talk about stolen wages, and it's pretty simple. And I'll just give you a little bit of the history, but just prior to colonisation, they say there's around 200,000 Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in Queensland. That population was reduced down to 25,000, and then in 1897, 22,000 of those are moved on to missions, settlements and reserves. That system stayed in place till 1986. Under the system, if you were Aboriginal, you would be educated to the grade 4, and at the age of about 12 or 13, you'd go and work. Men would work primarily on cattle stations, and women would be sent out to work as domestics all over Queensland. Quite interesting, there's so many files on this, individual files, because everybody was under a high level of surveillance. And so you could write to the local protector or the local mission and say, could you send me down to Indigenous girls to clean my house for 12 months? And they'd be sent down, they'd live in Brisbane behind your house, and they'd clean and do whatever you asked. And under the system, they had to work. They had to work obviously minimum 40 hours a week, and instead of being paid by the employer, it was under the law the employer was required to pay the government. And instead of passing that money on to the individuals who earned it, the government just kept it, sort of a trust case, we could say. And so that system lasted, as I say, till about 1976. It started to wind down, but 1986 was the end of it completely. But that's Queensland. There's some real nuances. I spent a lot of time. So I've worked primarily in Northern Territory, WA and Queensland, and there's some different issues across those jurisdictions. For example, in the Kimberleys, where I spent the last 6 years working, I love the Kimberleys. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, but they just had slavery. We just settled that case recently for $180 million. It's yet to be approved by the court, but 1920 was the second wave of settlement in the Kimberleys, so you can still talk to people who can tell you about how their grandparents and their parents were treated and shot and all this type of stuff. But they just worked as slaves on missions, slaves on missions and also cattle stations in those regions. They just didn't get paid. There's no money cycling through the system. So it's interesting. We talk about Australia's history, and when you start to dig deep, and I've worked on the Stolen Generations case in Northern Territory, we got $430 million settlement for that. I started the case. I was sitting around the table with a few elders, and they said, let's do it. I said, why not?
Wow.
And so, like the Northern Territory, for example, the economy was so small, they had to send everybody out. So the Stolen Generation people in the Territory were sent to missions all over the country and different places. Queensland's Stolen Generation is probably a bit different in that when they were put into missions at the age of 6, you were separated from your family, couldn't have contact with them. So there's this history there. I'm really interested. I've spent years working on it. I'm interested in where we're getting to this next stage, because there's a really strong commitment about truth-telling, and these are really powerful stories. I work there every day and hear this stuff, and I feel like my obligation is to share those stories. But I think once we all start to understand the history a bit better, we'll feel differently and maybe have different goals and ambitions for the future.
I hope so.
Yeah, I know we will. I mean, we're a decent group of people. And I think if we can be engaged both intellectually and emotionally, we'll start to understand what these issues are and as a nation want to make changes.
I love that optimism, and I share that wish and hope and vision as well. I know we had the recent referendum, and I don't know if that's something you want to talk about or not talk about. I suppose the question I have in regards to it specifically is what's next. But if you want to discuss or talk about how that was as an Indigenous man for you, but otherwise we're just looking to the future.
Look, I never put all my eggs in one basket. I like taking a lot of risks, but any investment's always 100% risk, I think about, and the voice was 100% risk. And certainly, hope my wife and two of our kids, our oldest, or 2 daughters, we featured in the Courier Mail. Just the weekend before, we had the Yes shirts on. They came and got some photos of us. So we were certainly front and centre in that, and I did a number of speaking engagements on the issue. It's a tough one because it's a really intellectual legal argument. And for me, someone who really prides themselves on being able to take complicated legal issues and explain them in a very simple form to people, it was very difficult to do that with the voice. And look, in hindsight, there's a lot of ways you can criticise it. It was certainly the option that was on the table, and I was in support of it because I understood it. Definitely had flaws. It's hard to articulate. And as a lawyer who looks for power and looks for things to be able to use to bring proceedings in court. It didn't have any of that ability. But look, as I say, I think the next thing is really truth-telling and treaty. I know Queensland have made a very strong commitment to that, and as have a number of states. And actually over the next month or so, I think Queensland's going to roll out some work around the truth-telling. So I'm pretty excited about that stage because I know the stories and I know how people will be able to relate to those stories. And I know the emotion and the depth and the impact on people. And so for me, that is really important. And in hindsight, it's probably something that should have happened first. In the same way that South Africa had their Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Canada had similar processes. People have to understand why we're asking them to take the step like the voice, and in the absence or the abstract, it's difficult to do.
What are some of the lessons from the stories? I mean, you said to us off air, you've thousands of conversations, is that right, with Indigenous people on all parts of country across this land. So what are some of those key stories that we can learn from?
Yeah, so the cases I worked on, there would be very few Aboriginal families in the Torres Strait Islanders, Queensland, Northern Territory and WA who wouldn't have been impacted by the case, whether it's native title, whether it's class actions. We represent thousands of people. And I say we because there is always a big team on these things and I'm just one cog in the wheel. But for me, the most challenging part has been understanding that Indigenous disadvantage in this country has been caused by laws. And people might have, bureaucrats and politicians might have very good will at the time, and the Protection Acts in Queensland's a very good example. You're able to be educated, but you're only able to be educated to grade 4. It caps your potential. You have to work, but your work, what you earn, is not yours. And under that legislation, actually any property, in law that means basically anything you own, automatically became an asset for the Crown, vested in the Crown, we say. So the inability to work and buy your own home has impacted 3 or 4 generations of Aboriginal families. They still live in poverty today, despite the fact their great-grandparents or their grandparents or their parents work sometimes 68 hours a week in a cattle station up north or out west and never earned anything. And so that, for me, is a real challenge. And I see the structural barriers that the law has created and really entrenches this disadvantage. And so being a lawyer, you want to change the world in a way. Well, I certainly want to. And something Cara and I have tried to do through the scholarship we've set up. But you see these issues, you can bring a really unique perspective and you try and make changes. But there's the change through the legal system, and then I think there's the change through being able to influence politicians and others through decisions they make, and actually just bringing a different perspective. And that's why diversity in leadership is really important, right? You have a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a bit about the scholarship?
Yeah, so Cara and I was turning 40 and I said to Cara, I want to do something different. I just do not want to have a birthday present and people buy me things I don't want and don't need. I'm over that. I don't drink, and I haven't drunk for 20 years, and people bring bottles of wine and stuff. And there's only so many times you can re-gift those things. So if you're ever looking for a bottle of wine, just come round. We've got stacks. But and I knew from the work I did, I needed more Indigenous women side by side with me. And I've been really strong in encouraging 2 Indigenous women in Queensland to come to the bar, and they've been there now 5 or 6 years. Because my anecdotal experience is Indigenous women who were alive during this period I'm talking about, the mid-1930s up, suffered horrendous levels of abuse, whether it's on cattle stations or whether it's in missions or whether with private employers. And people don't understand that about the Wave Hill strike, where Aboriginal people walked off and they say it's about their land. But if you read it, it's actually the first thing they say is you've been treating our women really badly. And so I needed Indigenous women to sit down next to me side by side and do the work I do and really pick up the baton. And Cara and I have a great relationship with Griffith University, and we sat down with them and said, we want to do this. And they came back with some even better ideas. So not just money, but how about you mentor? How about you support, apply and find employment opportunities? And we said, look, we'll commit to $25,000. That was 2 years ago. We've raised over $200,000 now. Wow. And we've had the first 2 recipients come through. Alicia George, who was the first, she just let us know the other day that her job next year is going to be working with the Chief Justice. We sort of mentor them. Keely Hughes has just come back. She spent 6 months in Canada. So we spent a lot of time trying to support them. I realised they've got all the academic ability. They're brilliant. And we don't select the recipients, Griffith actually do, but, they've got these great results. They've got all the work experience. They've worked out all these great firms, but they don't have the network and they don't have that additional support. And I feel like sometimes the conversations we're having is if you're a second or third generation lawyer, they're very much a conversation you should be having with your own children. And in a very informal sense, you got a barbecue and, hey, I've had a young Indigenous lawyer around my house and talking about what you should do. And I said to him, Matt, look, I'll get you a job tomorrow. And I called up my friends who work in class action. We got him a job tomorrow. And, being able to guide that sort of path, that if you don't have those relationships in law and you don't have that network, that we can really bring that. And the financial contribution we make to the students is important because when you're at uni, you've got no money. But secondly, that mentoring and that really big network of support is actually the key. I hope if we can make a little 2 or 3 or 5% impact on their careers, then that's the sort of stuff that we can bring to it. So very proud of that. We're actually just about to come up to our third recipient. I think applications close very soon. And so looking forward to see who that is. Indigenous women towards the end of the degree at Griffith University who have an interest in going to the bar, we'll support you.
That's incredible.
That is incredible. I can only imagine how rewarding that is for you.
Yeah. Actually, it's an interesting point because I was having a conversation this week about leadership and the greatest, I've realised over the years, more recently, probably the last 5 years, the greatest reward is bringing that next generation through. And I really hope that I can personally do things that to make an impact, whether it's increase the number of Indigenous judges or increase the number of Indigenous barristers or lawyers generally, and people don't know I exist and people don't know what I do.
Yeah.
In 20, 30 years' time, someone had the advantage of going through something or, you were able to make a change, you're able to talk to a politician and it started a bit of a movement and now that some young kid's benefiting 20 years later, that would be really special. So, yeah, leadership for me in law is about bringing this next generation of Indigenous lawyers through and providing both an example but a real level of support to be able to do that.
Yeah, incredible, really leaving a legacy.
Yeah, hopefully a legacy that people don't know.
I love the humility of that. You're like, I don't need the kudos. I just want to see the impact.
Yeah, that's right. I don't need I'm happy with my own life and the things I do, and I don't want to be someone who's necessarily up in the headlines for that type of thing, but I want to make an impact and I want people to be able to benefit if there is a next generation.
That's incredible. I imagine that just listening, the job as difficult as I imagine it to be in hearing the conversations from elders and having those, just listening to people gives them back something as well, just to be heard. How do you feel about that?
There's a few points. So, all my work is really steeped in trauma. And so you really have to you have to look after yourself. And I've learnt that. I did the Palm Island case and let's say there are 25 witnesses. I worked on that for a couple of years and all of those witnesses would have broken down and cried in the box 3 or 4 times. The judge would have to stop. It's very traumatic. And then working on these other cases, understanding history, how people were treated. And those people are still alive today. They can tell you about it. So there's that part. But the stolen gen is a really good example. And when we sat down with them, they said, we've been fighting for this for 20 years since the Bring Them Home report. We said, look, we can't promise you we can win, but we will have a crack. That's all we can do. And we started the case, and a short time later, the Prime Minister jumped on the TV and he said, we apologise for what happened. We're going to provide, I think it was $380 million in this redress scheme. And for me, it was a validation of people's experience because when I had that initial meeting up in Darwin, people were hurt from what happened to them, but they were more hurt the fact that there was sort of a part of the media or part of the belief out there is this didn't exist. There were a couple of stolen generation cases that had lost. And so it was an easy target. And some of them in particular really upset about the fact that they weren't being listened to and people didn't believe this story. And so the validation of that experience, and it was very much a similar feeling in Western Australia because that case, I think we announced the settlement towards the end of 2023. And I had a couple of calls from people and they were like, this is really important to recognise what happened to my grandmother or what happened to my mother. And so being able to, when you sit down with people and you realise they've been carrying this story for 3 generations, they're carrying their grandmother's story and their grandfather's story and their parents' story and their uncle's story. So to be able to bring some validation, some end to that journey, we could never totally undo what happened, and we could never really compensate people for what they lost. But we can bring some end, some finish, so the next generation hopefully don't have to carry that burden.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear you say that, and I kind of get goosebumps when you say it, because you really see it is that I guess resolution, that they can process through their trauma, the generational trauma that kind of gets stored up, and they can really I don't know, I guess provide some clarity for their generations for the future.
Well, it's that truth-telling point, right?
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, it's pretty hard to deny once the Prime Minister goes on TV and says we're sorry for what happened, we're going to set up this redress scheme, we're going to pay $380 million. That is huge. And people can get in the media and criticise what was said or what was done, but for them to experience that, it's very much in the vein of the Kevin Rudd apology, saying sorry to as he did to the stolen generations. And so that I hope that brings some comfort to people. That's all I can hope for.
Yeah, because I imagine no amount of money really makes that disappear. It's so, yes, there's compensation, but to be heard and the validation, I imagine that goes a long way.
A gesture or, some kind of acknowledgement.
Yeah, and particularly, say, Queensland, the stolen wages, we could trace all the money and we can tell they built Redcliffe Hospital, we can tell they built different things.
The powerhouse,
we can tell they can build a whole. So, it's like, the rest of the state, probably the country, benefited from that labour.
Yeah.
And that work, and the Indigenous people missed out. They horribly missed out. And so, if there's something little I can do to bring some recognition to that, and like I say, I think truth-telling will be a really important part of that going forward.
What does that practically look like with the truth-telling?
Yeah, Queensland will pass some legislation, Path to Treaty Act, and what it'll look like in Queensland, it's actually set out in the Act. A 5-person panel will conduct an inquiry over the next 3 years to investigate the whole range of the impact of colonisation, and so I think it'll be very much like a Royal Commission, and people may be familiar with those, where you've got lawyers, retired judges, experts in their field conducting an inquiry into all aspects really of government conduct, probably prior to colonisation, so the interactions between the British and what we wanted to do here in Australia, the early setup of the New South Wales colony and how that impacted Queensland. And then Queensland's interesting, just because something's happened in New South Wales in 1788 had no real direct impact here on the ground. It wasn't until the 1830s when you had people like Leichhardt come through Queensland and do the exploration, and then 1850 you had the settlement started rolling through. So, those sort of impacts. I not only sit down and speak to people about our history, but I really work with some of the best anthropologists, historians, archaeologists, linguists in Australia. And so I get the privilege of reading a lot of expert reports and seeing a lot of documents, and people will be surprised how many documents there are out there about this period, but really examining all that history and putting it out there for the community to understand what has happened and what has the impact been.
It's incredibly important, and I really, you can see I believe from where I sit, there's a shift in awareness and conversation, but there's still a lot of lack of education and transparency. It's a deeper conversation, even like in the education system, how much the kids are educated on the history. I don't know what your thoughts you have on that, being a dad as well.
Yeah, no, I feel like my 9-year-old daughter has a better grasp of Australia's history than most adults, actually. And I talk to her in a very child-focused way. I don't give her the hard stuff. Certainly haven't let her watch Incarceration Nation, but I say, look, Dad's going out and working on the Stolen Generation case this week. This is what happened in the Northern Territory, or this is what happened in Queensland. I'm working on stolen wages. I remember Cara, and my travel really impacts, right? It really impacts her. And she's she's a superstar. She's busy. She's got 3 kids, and her husband spends 50% of his time running around the country, so it hurts. But I was working on a case. I just got back from Doomadgee this week, and I remember when this case first came up, I sent Cara the Four Corners episode because and that episode showed that there were 3 people in Doomadgee, so the Aboriginal community in Queensland, which was actually set up under that protection era legislation. They were in heart failure. They went up to the hospital weeks on weeks, and they were given Panadol and sent home. And they all died. And I remember I sent her the episode, and I was like, "This is what I'm doing today." You know, like, don't give me any trouble when I get home. Like, I know you're having a bad week, but this is my day. I'm talking to people about how their loved ones died. And so every now and then she gives you a bit of space, but you're right on the cusp of it. It's pretty challenging work, and it's emotionally draining, and it's very traumatic. But you feel like you can make a difference, and you keep going. I just want to see a good example. It's sort of out of the left field, but I remember in law we had this president's dinner. It was a law society dinner, and I'd go, and I was the only black guy there, and I'd come home. Yeah, exactly right. And I'd come home in the car, and I was like, "This hurts, but I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going until there's a table of us." And I went one year, so year after year. I went one year, there was 2 tables, and one of the guys I know, Indigenous guy, won about 80% of the award. And I was like, that's it. I don't need to come again. So I probably haven't been for 6 or 7 years, but, you keep slogging away. You'll have people coming up behind you. And I always just think that's a good example of how things change.
Yeah. I'm so excited to see where your kids, no pressure on the 3 of them, but, where your kids end up. I believe, and tell me if I've got this right, but in and around the 26th of January, your eldest had a few words to say at school. I think that the teacher maybe said something extremely culturally insensitive or ignorant.
Look, Eden's like me. She just brings a different perspective. And so and I realised over time that people don't necessarily – it's not they disagree or they don't – it's just they haven't been exposed to a different view.
Yeah.
And it's not being malice or anything like that. It's just actually I never thought about that. I had this conversation this week because I've got a real interest in tech, and I was meeting with this tech guy, and I was talking about the Indigenous stuff, and he's just never heard it. And it's not – he was absorbing it like a sponge.
Like the story and the history?
Yeah, he just never got that perspective. And so, whether it's the education system or the workplace or wherever, and Eden is very much – she's highly intelligent, and she gets it because I talk to her about things, and she's interested. She learns. I don't know if you've ever read the book Sapiens, but she's reading the Sapiens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was like, wow, at 9 years old.
Wow.
But no, the teacher said something, and she said, well, I've got a different view. And actually her view is more Kara's view on Australia Day and Eden's view is more stricter than mine. I'm worried about trying to save people from dying in the Doomadgee hospital or, something else. But she's like, no, we don't celebrate Australia Day for these reasons. And, you've got to back your kids. And I'm glad that she, A, firstly had a different perspective. B, she felt comfortable to be able to articulate that. And C, she could come home and tell her parents. And she's very much of her own mind. Difficult to, as a parent, to try and manage her sometimes. But, I think I've said it before. I always think kids are born perfect and parents stuff them up. So I'm just hoping I don't stuff up my kids too much.
Oh, I love that. What a proud parent moment, I think. That must have been for you guys.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible. Kind of heart swells with pride.
Yeah, look, the kids are really impressive, and they've got their mum there, and I do good stuff. My mother's done some really amazing things too, so they've got plenty of examples really close to home. And actually, that's been a real pride, having Kara being such a leader and having 2 girls and being able to see that. I know that'll set them in really good stead going forward in their lives. So,
yes, incredible.
Josh, how do you you talk about kind of all these times that you go to Indigenous communities, you talk to, elders and record thousands of hours worth of stories. And imagine as an Indigenous man, they'd be, somewhat triggering for you as well from time to time. I assume that to be the case. We're all human after all. The question I'd really love to know is kind of what do you do for you in terms of like restorative practices? I guess you're kind of always withdrawing when you go to those places. Maybe not always deposits.
Yeah, it's interesting. I lost my youngest brother to suicide on Boxing Day 2022, and that really knocked me around. And it's given me probably 12, 14 months to be able to reflect, actually. And I realised I've actually just grown up with a lot of trauma. Someone asked me the other day about traumatic events, and I think I probably stopped about 40 or 50. And, whether that was suicides or a whole range of things. And so I've just grown up in that environment. It's a brutal environment. And, you talk about resilience. Well, I've been there. But also too, and it is a real burden to go out and to hear these stories, and sometimes to be the only Indigenous person on the team. Someone emailed me, a judge actually. I've got a good relationship with it and a lot of respect, and he was doing some stuff around history, and he emailed me some stuff to read, and I said, "Oh, Judge, it's always brutal. It's always tough to read how my people were treated." And he just was like, "Oh, sorry, Josh, I didn't think about that." But I think, and this is what I say about the personal sacrifice, like I really mean it. I'm out there doing it, and I know it takes a little piece off me all the time. I know it's damaging, but I debrief. I talk to people. I try and stay fit. There's a whole range of things I do, but it takes a toll. It takes a toll on me. It takes a toll on the family when I come home. It takes me depending on the stories. It takes me a few weeks to settle back into the groove. Depending on how intense they are. And you talked about Incarceration Nation. The day I saw the screening of it, I was sitting in my motel room in Darwin, and I actually was just interviewing Indigenous women that day on stolen wages, and they were all telling me how they were raped between the ages of 5 and 10. And I come home and I watch Incarceration Nation. I'm like, oh man, this is brutal. What a day. And but you have to be smart, and you have to realise that you can't help anyone unless you're in a good place. And I knew that really early on in my career. You get yourself, there's no point going out there damaged, you're not going to make an impact. You've always got to be, and there is a bit of sort of self-importance in that. You've always got to look after yourself, because otherwise it'll slowly just work you down. And whether you're in criminal law and you deal with all the child molestation stuff, I couldn't do that. Or whether you're in the work like mine and it's 10 years of trauma, you've got to look after yourself.
I'm so sorry about your brother. I remember actually sitting at lunch with your wife, and she said, "Oh, I'm solo parenting at the moment." I said, "Oh, okay. What's happening?" And she said, "Oh, Josh has gone to Everest." I said, "Oh, really? Is that right? Is it something he's had on his bucket list for a while?" She said, "Oh, no. There was about a 10-day window," which sounds fun, but obviously that came as a part of your brother's, of the loss of your brother. And if you're happy to maybe share a little bit around, I guess, your experience and what you want to share there, and tell us about Everest, what you've learnt. There's a lot there. You start and go where you'd like to go.
Look, like I say, I was the oldest of 4. My brother was born when I was 15 years old, and so I was very much like a father to him, particularly those first 5 or 6 years when I still lived in Yeppoon. And even after, we'd ring each other every day, or I'd ring him. And so when he got to the age of about 15, he started to have some mental health issues. Just every now and then the dial would go up, and it wasn't anything like, he'd have to be hospitalised, but there was a bit of instability. And, that was, it sort of became him, actually. He passed away at 26, but, that's 11 years of it. And so, he had a family, he had a job, he had all those things. He had a relationship bust up, and then he had another partner. So, he lived his life. But we were all home Christmas, so back up in Yeppoon at my mother's house, and we were having wasn't an amazing Christmas. Sometimes they're really good, sometimes they weren't, but we've all got kids now, so we were sort of getting into it for them. And then the next day, I get this call, and, him and his partner have an argument. And I go out there, and the next call, less than an hour or so later, my mother says my brother's dead. And so I get out there, my sister's out there, and I think there's 2 parts that are really challenging. There's obviously the loss, the experiencing that. And Cara said to me at one stage, you can live with grief. It's the guilt and regret that'll really get you down. And I've had my fair share of guilt and regret with this one. But so he's there, I'm there, the ambulance is there, end up about 3 ambulance buses and police, and my sister found him, and she was trying to revive him and all this stuff. And so the next 4 hours, firstly the first hour is they're trying to keep him alive, so I'm watching them trying to keep my brother alive. That's brutal.
Yeah.
But the police and the ambulance were just so respectful, and actually made what could have just absolutely disintegrated me just a little bit better by, providing the support. And then they don't move the body right. I never realised this. I've never been through it. So you got to wait for forensics to come. They do their thing. You got to wait for the funeral home to come, do their thing. So I'm with my brother's body for 4 hours, me and my sister. Very fortunate, one of my good school friends had come down. He was very close and he sat with us. But so I think there's a trauma from the loss, but there's a trauma from that 4 or 5 hours as well that really hit me. And it was a tough journey coming out of Christmas. Christmas is always an amazing period for us. My sister's born on the 1st of December. My mother was born on the 26th of January. So we've got these 2 bookends. I'm born on the 29th of December. We've got all these birthdays in between that. My brother was the 4th of January. So I always had a really nice time, a really special time. And, this happened to my brother a few days later. It was my birthday. I couldn't even talk to people. I didn't even want to acknowledge it was my birthday. And I just went through a tough few months. And Cara and I had gone down to the Gold Coast for Easter holidays around March, April. And it was just crap. I didn't want to be there, and I just made sure the family knew I didn't want to be there. And we got back and she's like, you better do something about this. Like, you've got to get yourself in shape. And I was like, I want to do something physically and mentally challenging. And like you say, I said, Everest, I went and paid for it. 4 or 5 days later, I was sitting at the airport, ran into someone I knew, and I was like, why am I doing this? But I did it, and no training. I think I walked the dog up Balmoral Hill a few times. So, I went and brought everything I needed to buy, and so I needed it, actually. I needed that, and it was a huge shift mentally. And I think it was a shift mentally because I realised on that journey I have everything I need in life right here. I have that mental focus, I have the resilience, I have the determination. I don't need the nice flashy things. I've got nice flashy. I just need a little bit of food to not starve. I need to keep a little bit warm, not necessarily stop me from freezing, but, I'm sort of in that point. And myself. And I can get through the toughest conditions, like I have got through for the rest, most of my life. And so that sort of journey was really, really special. And it shifted me dramatically from where I was to when I come back. But I got to base camp and, it's 8 or 9 days walking or whatever it is. Joined up with an organised tour, and there was 6 Australians, 2 Americans, just really lovely people. Really, the Aussie guys were great. They were a little bit younger, and I was like, oh, what are they going to be like? And they're just really welcoming. And sometimes with the US guys, travelling with US guys, you probably tolerate them more than you accept them. But there was a bit of that. But they were great too. And I got to base camp and it was hugely emotional for me. The day before I was getting altitude sickness, and you get a bit spaced out when you got altitude sickness, and my head's rolling around. I was like, I'm doing this journey for my brother, and it was physically tough. And I got to base camp and I got there and I just sat down and I started crying. Because I was like, I was doing this for my brother, like that's what the journey was about. And it was pretty special to do that. And I realised, and then the next day the guy was like, do you want to walk out? So it's 3 or 4 days walk out. I was like, I'm hiring a chopper. So I called a chopper and I chop it out of there. And I was like, back to Kathmandu in 30 degrees. And I don't think I left my room for 36 hours. Like, I walked into the motel, I said, give me the best room you've got. And I was like, some $200 a night place in Kathmandu. And I just didn't leave. I had to thaw out firstly.
Yeah.
I had to eat something, and then I jumped back. But while I was over there, I thought I would love to have done something like this with my brother. And even my other brother, I mentioned him the other day, would he come on this? But, that's not possible. And I came back and I was like, I really want to do this journey with people I care about. And so we're going, as you say, next week in 4 days, I think, or 3 or 4 days. And I'm going with 11 people. 11 of my friends and some of their connections, and it's going to be such a different journey. And that journey was about, trying to get through the loss of my brother, and I feel like this will be a little bit about the legacy he's leaving, celebrating that.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
And you're fundraising for this one too.
Yeah, that's right. So really good. One of the guys who's coming, I went to uni with, Dr. Clinton Schultz. He actually started SOBAR, which is that non-alcoholic beverages business. Yeah. Great friend. His wife, I've known her for 25 years since she grew up in Yeppoon. They're down the Gold Coast, but he also is a psychologist. He works for Black Dog Institute, and he leads up their Indigenous Lived Experience Centre, which is all about suicide and crisis prevention. And so I wanted to raise some money for that, and I said, how about we just try and get to the $50,000, and we're a few days from leaving. We're about 40,000, and hopefully we get a bit more coming in. But yeah, being able to, I mean, all of us on the journey probably feels like we've had some association with that issue, and just to be able to do something positive and hopefully have an impact out in communities is going to be really important. And, it's about sort of always trying to use my profile and my things to make a difference, and that's going to be something important for all of us on this journey.
So great. So great. I love seeing the photo of you from your first trip with the Aboriginal flag up at the at that big rock where it's etched in the Everest base camp on the rock.
Yeah, I'm always, for most people, I'm probably the one or two Aboriginal people actually know, right? And so you're always under a microscope, and you've always got an exciting example. And I did that when on the walk. I felt like, well, I'm representing not just me and my family. I'm representing my mob, my community, and I carried that flag. I didn't have time to understand what would be at base camp, but I thought there will be something there so people can recognise. And I get there and there's this, 20-ton rock or something. I'm like, all right, this flag's coming out. I've been carrying it, waiting for it, and I got the pic. It was great.
And this time with 11 of you, 12 of you?
Yeah, 11 of us.
11 of you up again. I reckon that's the remake the photo.
Yeah, it will be. And one of the guys is from the Torres Strait too, so we'll have the Torres Strait Islanders represented. And I think it's just going to be a journey. I'm really looking forward to that bonding and that relationship that will form, because I know how tough it is, and I know the challenges we'll go through. But I know that I think all of us will bond and have another layer of our relationship after that experience. So, yeah, it's going to be pretty special. And actually, a few people are talking about, not this group, but they've got some people talking about 2025. So I'm like, you want to come? I'll take you.
Yeah, I was wondering, is this going to be an ongoing kind of pilgrimage experience? It's phenomenal.
I might join you for that one if you'll have me.
Yeah, no, it's a great crew. And actually what's quite interesting is a lot of people who next year are in business, not necessarily an Indigenous group, but in business and interested. And, you become a bit of a beacon or a bit of an excuse, and people say, yeah, let's do it. And so, no, it is. I love the Himalayas. And I was sitting at the airport in Kathmandu on the first journey. I was like, do I need to go home, or could I just stay here for another 6 months? There are probably 4 reasons why I needed to go home, so they won out. But there's certainly other tracks I want to do for myself, but through the Himalayas, it's another world up there. But being able to take a group to Everest every year, why not? I'm on board for that.
Yeah, it's somewhere we've travelled pretty well across the globe, and it is one of the places I haven't been, and I imagine it's on top of my list actually. And I imagine regardless of your religious view, it's such a spiritual place.
Highly spiritual. You either feel like you're up there with the gods, or this is, the gods live here, or the mountains are gods, because the mountains have their own personalities. And it's interesting, when you're flying to Lukla, which is about 2,800 metres, there's no motors, there's no cars or anything after that. So, everything is, you're either carrying it around, or there's yaks, and, there's no electricity in a lot of places. And so it's really, you wind back the clock to the bare essentials of things that you need to survive. But it is a highly spiritual experience. And I've chatted to a few people, and everyone who says they've been there it's impacted them in some way.
Yes. Oh, how incredible. A couple of nights to go.
Yeah, the final countdown. So I'm looking forward to it, actually.
By the time this is released, you will have been and gone. So we might need to check back in. We will check back in with you and throw it on the end of the episode just to give a little wrap up on the takeaways. But yeah, that's incredible. Incredible. Do you have any more questions about Everest or?
Got lots of questions about Everest actually, but we can maybe go into that at another stage. But I'm running a marathon this year,
yes.
And did a half marathon yesterday. That was interesting. I'm feeling the effects of that in my body today and my mind to an extent. The Everest or a Patagonia trek has been high on my list, because I think it is kind of about meeting your edge mentally and physically. Do you think if you had to choose between the physical and the mental, what was harder?
Oh, it's a mental journey. And it's a good example. I'm glad you mentioned the marathons, because when I was over there, I realised it really I started to understand why people start to do ultra marathons, why you hit 40 and you're like, I'm going to start doing this. And I realised it because you get to our stage in life, you don't have a lot of challenges. You have a really good career. You've got the family stuff sorted. Life's really good. I don't need to do anything else and I'm going to retire pretty successful. Like I could pull up shop tomorrow and it's game over. And so you don't feel like, I certainly don't feel like you're out there pushing your edge all the time. So you don't need to do it every day, but every now and then you need to be alive, right? You need to live. And so I started to understand why, okay, I'm doing this journey. I know why now people do ultra marathons. I know why they start doing marathons. And it was very much like that. Physically, you can get through it. It's just, I remember day 2 on the journey and it's the mental challenge. It's getting up every day where you're absolutely freezing, you feel like crap, you're spaced out from the altitude and just putting one foot after the other. And just knowing that, you know what, even in the toughest times, you can still get through. And so your experience with that and wanting to do EBC base camp, I understand that because I did that. That really struck me last year. And so I came back and actually I flew back. I went out to Alice Springs a week or 2 after and they've got this the Monster McDonald run or challenge out there and you do 25, 50, 125, 250 and I came back and I was like, I'm going to do that soon because of the same feeling you probably get from doing the marathon running, that challenge where you don't always get that once you get to a certain point in your life and your career.
Mm.
Yep, that really resonates. Really, really resonates.
I'm sitting here with a small amount of guilt, like, oh, I better be doing some of this.
I know.
I think you'll find your thing.
Yeah.
And you meet your edge every day in lots of ways. So
ways,
being married to
maybe.
me is one of them. But,
That's another podcast for another time. Josh, one thing, it's a little bit off from what we've been discussing here, but when we're here on our podcast about Lead with Courage and we're talking to leaders and people in business, one thing that I'm going to just from my own perspective, I was a bit uncomfortable with, and from the intention I was there, but I felt almost, does this come across inauthentic? And my opinion did shift when we went to Uluru last year before.
Another very spiritual place.
A very special place, a very, very special place, phenomenal experience. Which was acknowledgement to country in a corporate setting. And I was always at the beginning of our workshops and if we were presenting, always saying an acknowledgement to country. And prior to my visit to Uluru, I felt like it might have been perceived as a tick box exercise, which was kind of against the whole reason of doing it. Upon returning from Uluru, I did feel a different level of connection and like actual genuine drive that this is something I want to say for my own reasons. But in speaking to a few people in the corporate world who are maybe not Indigenous but still wanting for that diversity, inclusion and acknowledgement, do you have thoughts, opinions or advice on that topic?
What I've found in my journey through my career is there's a huge amount of goodwill in the non-Indigenous community for Indigenous issues. Huge amount. Our scholarship's a good example. People want to do things, but they don't know how. They don't know the entry point. And I want to talk about Australia, I guess, as a nation. And I think we really struggle as a nation to have an identity. Mm. We don't. There's a lot. What is it? Is it going to barbecues and watching the cricket, or is it going fishing? Is it going? We don't have a strong
watching Bluey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, probably more so now. We don't have a strong sense, a national identity. I'm not saying we all have to be, and we don't all have to be nationalists and bang on the door and stuff. But I actually think part of that is not being able to reconcile our past, our relationship with Indigenous Australians.
Yeah, I agree.
And so, I don't want to harp on about truth telling, but when people start to understand those types of issues, our history, and actually it should form part of our identity as a nation. And because of that identity, there's certain practices that, we want to incorporate in what we do. It's like international tourists. When they come here, they want to learn about Indigenous culture. They go to Uluru, they go to all these places, they want to learn about things. But we as a nation actually don't want to embrace that yet. And because of that, I think we really struggle. It's like the issue you're saying. It's like, well, how does that fit in? But when we have a stronger sense of our past and our relationship with First Nations people, I think those things might become more, they're accepted because a lot of people do them, but there might be a bit of a greater appreciation or understanding as to why we do those and a greater acceptance that Indigenous First Nations history is a big part of our Australian history and identity today.
So just keep learning, just keep having conversations with First Nations people, keep being curious about what you can learn and maybe broaden the horizons, whether that's watching shows like Incarceration Nation or just listening to podcasts, conversations. Is that the practical advice?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there will be a lot of material published through Truth Telling about our history, and there's some really amazing books actually and out there. But let me say this. Education is a missing piece in our journey. And I sit down and I sit on the council at Griffith University. You know, I've sit on different legal boards and committees, and I often, you know, I'll sit down and I'll give a lecture on my work. And I feel like I am often in the room with some of the most successful, some of the most educated, some of the biggest leaders in law or in the university sector, and they haven't heard this stuff. And so if people at that, you know, and they're 60 years old, or if people at that level haven't been educated, then we have a real problem. Mm-hmm. And so I do think education, and whether it's through self-education and trying to get the right resources or just education more generally about our history is probably the really critical part. You know?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that something you said really resonated with me too, and I remember what it is now, so that's a win for me. That entry point you talked about, it is. I think a lot of people, myself included, find it tricky just to work out kind of where that point is into the conversation. I think having this today has helped kind of, you know, sort of provide like a little bit more exposure. And I have watched Incarceration Nation and certainly been tuning into a lot of what you've done and the great work that people like you have done. It's an opportunity for us, and you know, hopefully in 10 years' time when we are on episode 3000 and we get you to come back and talk about that, there'll be a lot of movement in that space.
Yeah, I said to Trent Dalton recently, and everyone loves Trent in Australia. I was like, Trent, you need to come out with me. I call the people I work with the Forgotten Australians, because they're really largely responsible for the benefits that we had in it to our economy and through our pastoral industries and people, the help in the homes. But you need to come out with me, and we need to do a story on these Forgotten Australians. And I want to take you to these communities and sit down and you start to hear these, because people like Trent and others can cut through. You know, they can share those stories to a wider audience. And I feel like that's the obligation I have. Learn the stories, learn the history, meet those people and have those relationships, but share those stories. And so whether it's in a room like this, I think last weekend I was sitting down at some friends and talking to their friends about my work and educating them too. And we're just having a Sunday morning breakfast. So I've got that responsibility. It's something I share. I actually, before this whole social media stuff, I sort of thought about our history and our journey in this context. The first Indigenous people, and I mean first, is who were impacted by those laws, had no ability to influence their own circumstances. They couldn't do anything at all. And then you get to this stage where people could strike. You know, they'd go to the local protector's office, or the strikes in Wave Hill, where it's like, we are not working. That's all we can do. The next generation, I call them the marchers. You know, they were marching against Bjorka Peterson. They'd come out of the missions and they're like, we're not going to stand for this. My generation of Indigenous leaders, I think we're the influencers. You know, yes. We are talking to the politicians. We are talking to the judges, the key decision makers in community, trying to influence decisions. The next generation, like my kids, they will be decision makers. They don't have to influence anybody. And so that's sort of where I feel like my generation of Indigenous leaders fits in, that we've got to influence people who make decisions about us.
I feel so inspired hearing that transition and each generation, and it fills me with so much inspiration and hope, and yeah, just so much joy to hear that that's where we're going. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing for our country, for all people.
Yeah, well, you know, how can you understand your future if you don't know your past? And I'm a very good segue. I'm a very good sort of intermediary between I understand those things and I have really, you know, strong views, or, you know, I have a good insight into where we could go as a nation in the future. And I want to make an impact. It's really what it comes down to.
If there was one piece of advice that we could wrap this conversation up with for leaders or business owners of what action in their businesses, what advice you would give around inclusive cultures or embracing diversity, what would that be?
Educate yourself and your team. There are some good programs that are starting to roll out there in the country around Indigenous capability and Indigenous history and knowledge, and it doesn't take much. I don't do it a lot. I'm not interested in it, but sometimes I'll sit down, I'll talk to people, and they'll learn a lot more than an hour than they've learned a lifetime. Very much like this conversation, particularly when it is just focused on history. And so, there's a lot of things you can do to start to understand, I guess, the impact. And when you start to understand that history like I do, I know why there's high rates of suicide in the Kimberleys, or why kids don't go to school in the Northern Territory, or why there's real disadvantage in Kununurra and those places. I know it, and I've been there, I've worked there, I know the history, I know the laws, I know that really things won't change unless governments change the way they operate. So you're really informing yourself about the Indigenous issues, the history, the disadvantage, and how you can make an impact. One of the great conversations I had this week was with somebody who's in a position to make a real impact, really, really big at what they do, and sits in the shadows. But unless people like him and I come together, you need that bridge. And I think there is the missing piece in Indigenous space is actually economic, the economic benefit, but it's really that corporate leader space where we need leadership because we need influencers. And I saw it done particularly well in the gender space. I think last year, probably 10 years ago, they had the sort of champions in the Indigenous and the women's area, and people like the chairman or the CEO out of Horizon were one of the champions, and there were some really great leaders in the community. We actually need that in the Indigenous space. We need people to give a damn. And I know at the political level in the state, they say, oh, I'm the champion for Yarrabah community, or I'm the champion for Palma. Well, we need people in the corporate space to be champions too, because they're sitting in boardrooms and they're having conversations with other people that can make a really big difference. So educate yourself, get engaged, and start to make an impact in that space, because a lot of the disadvantage in the Indigenous community is an economic one. And, the corporate space can have a real influence on that.
Great advice. Thank you. Thank you. Josh, it has been such a delight having you on here. I feel really honoured to be sharing this space with you, and the more I discover what you're actually doing, it blows my mind. And I can hear Cara in my head saying to me, see, I told you, he's just doing incredible things out there, and don't stop, and good luck in Everest. But thank you for everything that you're doing, because I truly believe that you are making this world a better place for all people. So thank you.
Yeah, that's what leadership's about. I think you just want to make it better for the next generation coming through, and that's a responsibility I've had for a long time, and I want to keep doing it to the best I can.
Thanks for joining us on the Lead with Courage podcast. We illuminate leadership, and it's our mission to inspire and grow the leaders of today to create a better tomorrow. We hope and trust that this episode has given you some insights and joy to empower you to live your biggest, best life. If you did enjoy the episode, we'd be so grateful for you to rate and share wherever you listen to this podcast. And until next time, go and lead with courage. Illuminate Leadership is not a licensed mental health service or a substitute for professional mental health advice, treatment, or assessment. Any conversation in this podcast is general in nature, and if you're struggling, please see a healthcare professional or call Lifeline on 131114.